To our program. So our next speaker is Evyatar Friesel. He received all his degrees from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I won't say when he received his PhD because I don't know. He began teaching in 1965. In 1987, attained the rank of Professor of Jewish History. 1980, and then he is currently a Professor Emeritus for Modern Jewish History at the Hebrew University. He was State Archivist of Israel in the years 1992 to 2001. He has worked on the interrelation of major events in modern Jewry, such as the creation of Israel and the Holocaust, modernization and Jewish normalization, Judeophobia in Israel, and has published on these themes. He recently is a co-author of a volume about present-day anti-Semitism in Germany. He will be speaking to us on the topic, Jews Against Israel, the ambivalences of contemporary Jewish identity. And allow me just to point out before he starts that there's no break in between. We go on to the next session, so please don't go out expecting another coffee break. Thank you, and again, I turn the floor over to Professor Friesel. By the way, we ask you to sign this afterwards. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, anti-Israel Jews are causing for increasing tensions in contemporary Jewry due to their views and also because they adopt positions quite similar to those of non-Jewish anti-Semites. I wonder if we pay enough attention to that growing phenomenon, and I'm glad that at this very important conference, the theme has been debated and brought up. I found that in the last 15 years, there were 28 books critical of Israel and of Zionism, published in English and German. I mean books by Jews, and the list is far from complete. And this without mentioning lectures, interviews, and articles. We should admit it, we are confronted here with a broad ideological attack. Such Jews are frequently dismissed, especially in Israel, as self-hating Jews or even as Jewish anti-Semites. I completely disagree. To see them as such as simplistic, inexact, and only encompass their understanding of a growing ideological phenomenon in actual Jewish life, to which also some Israelis belong. And we should not forget the distinctive kind of anti-Israelism found among ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Haredim, but this is beyond the scope of this lecture. Jewish anti-Israelism is, in my view, an expression of the complexities of contemporary Jewish identity. The dramatic events of the 20th century, mass immigrations, the destruction of the European Jewry, the establishment of Israel, upset whatever sociological equilibrium existed in Jewish societies, plural societies, and brought up new and unavoidably contradictory cultural and ideological tendencies. One of them, Jewish anti-Israelism, is basically anti-Zionism in new garb. Many of the utterances of representative figures of that trend are outright weird. A grotesque but not untypical example. In February 1915, after attacks against Jews in Paris, Prime Minister Netanyahu called French Jewry to migrate to Israel. In reaction, a German Jewish professor, Micha Blumlik, published an article in a German journal under the title, "Israel, I Remain Here, as a German among Germans." Netanyahu's call, he wrote, represented the Jewish collective death wish, ein jüdischer Todeswunsch. of Jews coming to Israel to die together. In his opinion, such a longing runs like a red thread through Jewish history, quotation, yes? Israel then presented as a death wish, not an expression of Jewish existential strength. Although not so bizarre declarations abound. In an interview in Germany, Moshe Zuckerman, an Israeli professor, explained in best Marxist fashion that the Zionist movement had an interest in the existence of anti-Semitism since it was a means to its goals. The American Jewish professor Judith Butler declares that Hamas, whose main reason of existence is the destruction of Israel, is a movement that belongs to the progressive international camp. Frequent also is the apocalyptic view about Israel's future. The title of a book by Zuckerman, published in German in 2014, proclaims, quote, the destiny of Israel, how Zionism pursues its doom. Such utterances of anti-Israel Jews are built on similar sociological foundations. One is external, meaning their ideological and social connections in Western political life. The other is internal, namely their views about the present Jewish condition. Regarding the external dimension, modern Jews were traditionally close to, in a sense, dependent on the so-called progressive or leftist ideological direction in Western society. This was the political sector most positively disposed, or at least most open-minded regarding Jews, and represented a political environment where Jews felt relatively secure. This liberal and leftist sector also supported the Zionist enterprise in Palestine and later the young Jewish state. However, since the last decades of the 20th century, a shift happened. From endorsement, many leftists changed to critique and to opposition to Israel. Worse, this negative attitude is frequently formulated in terms that are plainly anti-Semitic. How to understand such a bewildering phenomenon? One explanation is it relates to the attitude of the new left towards Muslims. Present-day leftists are straining themselves to find areas of agreement and collaboration with a broad Islamistic camp. It is a blend of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism mixed with guilt feelings about past wrongdoings, real or imaginary, of the European in Muslim countries. The problem is that to build political and cultural ties between European leftists and Muslims is extremely difficult, since their fundamental values are incompatible. Islamists and Western liberals or leftists disagree on almost everything: secularism, separation between state and religion, human rights, economic policy, equality of women, and much more. There is one issue, however, where the two sides do meet. Both oppose the Jewish state. There may be variations in the argument, but the anti-Israel positions are similar. There is a clear ideological interaction between European and Muslim anti-Israelism. Leftist activists and organizations participate in Muslim manifestations against Jews and Israel in European cities. The BDS movement is a leftist phenomenon. Muslim anti-Israelism started as political a result of the continuing Palestinian-Israeli conflict, although by now it had also assumed ideological aspects. However, what happens on the left belongs primarily to the realm of Western culture. Here is the old Judeophobic mindset resurging again, unconsciously or even consciously, in parts of Western society. Nowadays, it's the Jewish state, that modern expression of Jewish vitality, that is a major aim that revived animosity. Such a spiritual development brings up gloomy reflections. Apparently, the lessons of the tragedy of the European Jewry during the 1940s have not penetrated deeply enough into the collective consciousness of the West. The deep-rooted strength of, of Judeophobia shows again its resiliency. As described by Friesel, Judeophobia is like a chameleon that along the centuries changes and rechanges colors while remaining the same. Negative attitudes toward Jews remain as Jewish. And what is more Jewish than the Jewish state? Have clearly survived. Presently, the ideological impulse of Jew hatred comes no longer from the right, as in mid-20th century. The main drive of actual Judeophobia, at least in the intellectual sense, emerged from the left in the form of anti-Israelism. That new trend has caused dismay and even confusion among Jews. Israel is a dominant reality in actual Jewish life. A Jew can hardly avoid to ask him or herself how she or he stands with regard to Israel. The Jewish states represent a conceptual and emotional anchor for Jews, but not for all. There is a growing sector in present-day Jewry indifferent regarding Israel. And there is a Jewish current actively opposed to the Jewish state. Many of those Jews belong to the leftist or the so-called progressive camp of Western society. Typically, they are opposed to nationalism, which they see as retrograde, and define themselves as Europeans or Western or cosmopolitan. They disagree with major tendency in Israeli society, since many Israelis define themselves as nationalistic. Right political positions have reached significant public influence in Israel, and many Israelis are religious or to some degree religiously observant. The cosmopolitan view in diaspora Jewry finds little resonance in Israel. There are parallels between the actual anti-Israel Jews and Jewish currents in the past. Back in the 1950s, the historian and publicist Isaac Deutscher described the Jewish type he labeled as a non-Jewish Jew, and who was quite similar to the one described above. The Zionists called such a Jew an assimilationist. In fact, more than a specific figure, this non-Jewish Jew expressed a tendency in Jewish society because Jews always adapted to the non-Jewish environment along history. They took over from the cultural and social economic characteristic of the non-Jewish environment, this while maintaining the Jewish specificity. However, this was, and remains, an inherently unstable process where adaptation can slip into assimilation in the gradual waning of Jewish identity. A similar process is happening in the changed circumstances of our days. Controversies with actually anti-Israel Jews do not arise due to matters of religion, Jewish or non-Jewish, since most of them have little interest in religion. Most of them are also indifferent to issues that are important in contemporary Jewish life, such as Jewish assimilation or the resurgence of the Western Judeophobia. What turns a dormant disagreement into a forntation is foremostly how to define the Jewish collective. The idea of a Jewish people, a people self-conscious and active, rubs a sore spot on the weakened or very particular Jewish self-awareness of such Jews. And they literally jump at the mention of Zionism. Like most of present-day Jews, they too are touched by the Zionist spark, but in a negative way. An example. The English Jewish professor Jacqueline Rose, in her book, The Quest of Zion, where Rose stumbled on the 17th century Jewish messianic figure, Shabtai Tzvi, who towards the end of his life diverted to Islam and destroyed the movement he had inspired. Rose builds an amateurish parallel between Shabtai Tzvi and centuries later the Zionist movement. Her conclusion is that Zionism is a messianic aberration whose success in the form of Jewish statehood carries in it the seeds of its own destruction. A major conceptual question emerging from these debates is how to understand Israel in the broader framework of Jewish history. The answer I suggest is to recognize Jewish statehood as an adaptation to the conditions of our time, a pattern that happened again and again along the history of the Jews. As a Jewish response to the challenges and the possibilities of the present world, a response that is complex and difficult, but essential for the continuing existence of the Jewish people. Jewish anti-Zionists offer no convincing answer to that fundamental quest, and they soon get lost in this or that critique of Israel. Their strong emotional drive may suggest a personal element, although it does not explain the historical continuity of Jewish anti-Zionism, nor its broad actual prevalence. And yet, something seems wrong in what I would call the emotional wiring of these people. They weep over the ordeals, real or imaginary, of the Palestinians, but are quite indifferent to the dangers and worries, some of them highly realistic, of the Israelis. Many of those views are rightly surrealistic. The conflict between the Palestinians and Israel described as a static landscape drafted in black and white, where one side, the Arabs, the Palestinians, the Iranians, do nothing, never threaten, are not accountable for anything. The only active and responsible bearing factor are the Israelis, and they, of course, are always wrong. To see the Jewish state as a huge achievement, born in almost impossible circumstances, who step by step worked itself up to a first world status, that seems beyond the emotional capabilities of the Jews. On the contrary, the Israeli professor Shlomo Zand concludes in a book from 2012, I quote, "The historical myths that were once able to create Israeli society are now powerful forces helping to arise the possibility of its destruction. to understand Jewish statehood as a necessary development in Jewish history, that seems beyond the intellectual horizons of these Jewish intellectuals. In addition, there is a significant difference of behavior between the Jewish assimilationists of the recent past and the Jewish Israel critics of the present. Unlike the anti-Zionists of old, present-day Jewish critics preach mostly outside, namely to non-Jews. And this is especially true regarding the Israelis among them. In other words, what was once an internal dispute with Jews debating Jews has it turned into an affair mainly external, which is plainly weird. It is like an English intellectual critical of British society whose main platform is, let us say, in France. And many anti-Israel Jews say exactly what outspoken Gentile Jew or Israel haters want to hear, and so confer legitimacy to Judeophobia. After all, it is said, is a well-known Jewish professor so-and-so has such critical views about Israel, they must be true, he certainly knows. To make sure, it's absolutely legitimate to criticize aspects of Israeli life and politics. Every newspaper in Israel does it every day. At the same time, there is no reason not to believe the Iranian Ayatollahs or other Islamists when they declare that their aim is to eliminate the Jewish state. To support the ideological trend behind such political intentions, as supposed Jewish liberal and moralists do, means to adopt toward Israel and its Jewish population a position that ultimately backs the aims of the worst enemies of Jews and Jewry. And yet, it is a contention of the present examination that Jewish anti-Israelism still represents a Jewish condition, part of the very complex sociological realities of contemporary Jewish life. True, in many cases, the only affirmation of Jewishness of many neo-assimilationists is a negative one, the anti-Israelism. Nevertheless, they are not against other Jews in the sense that classical Jew haters are, even if many of their utterances are similar. It is not with Jews they have a problem, it is with Israel, or more exactly, with the underlying Zionist concept and its present-day expression. It may seem strange to find Israeli Jews in that group, but as it happens, in Israel there are Jews who want to assimilate into some hypothetical new collective identity, this out of opposition to Zionism, to the Zionist idea, or because they are unhappy with the social and cultural trends in Israeli society, or whatever reason. As their attempts show, they fought to sketch a mythical state of the Jews devoid from roots in Jewish history, as also certain non-Jewish intellectuals suggest, is an exercise in futility that leads to nothing. In Yiddish, there is a classical saying, "Es ist schwer zu sein ein Yid." It's hard to be a Jew. Many of the Jewish Israel critics dream about a kind of Jewishness light that never existed in Jewish history, and especially not in modern times. The anti-Israel positions of anti-Zionist Jews provide them with a platform, but one they share with doubtful companions. Their trumpets are shrill, but their message bears no hope. They offer no vision of a continuous Jewish life. And yet, we should not delude ourselves. We are faced here with an ideological upheaval in present-day Jewry, and there is reason to fear that the situation will not get better. Thank you very much.